All right, so Léna Remy-Kovach is a PhD candidate and lecturer at the Albert-Ludwigs-Universität in Freiburg. Your presentation title for today is Strategies for Healing and Survivance in Contemporary Indigenous Wonderworks. And Léna is, as I said, a PhD candidate and a lecturer at the University of Freiburg in Germany. She holds a BA in both English and Italian studies and has an MA in American history from the University of Strasbourg in France, as well as an MA in Indigenous and Canadian studies from Carleton University in Canada. Her thesis focuses on strategies for healing in contemporary horror and Gothic Indigenous literature. Other research projects include the commodification of Indigenous monsters in Euro-American horror television series and the imagery of hunger and cannibalism in recent young adult fiction by Indigenous writers. She also teaches Indigenous literatures, history, and cultural studies at the Department of North American Studies in Freiburg. So needless to say, I'm very curious about what you will talk to us about in the presentation. You can take the floor.
So thank you, Danny, for the introduction, and thank you, Danny and Ido, for having me today. So as Danny said, my dissertation focuses on identifying strategies for healing and survivance in contemporary Gothic, dark fantasy, or horror literature that is written in English by Indigenous authors from what we now know as North America. So today I'll give some examples of the research and explain also what the goals are. What am I supposed to do with that beyond the dissertation? Two very important definitions to start with so that we're all on the same page when it comes to the context. I want to start with defining intergenerational trauma. Sometimes you will see it as transgenerational trauma, which we also call legacies of loss. And it's defined by the APA as the transmission of historical oppression and its negative consequences across generations. There is evidence of the impact of intergenerational trauma on the health and well-being of Indigenous people in colonized countries. The transgenerational effects are not only psychological, but also familial, social, cultural, neurobiological, and possibly even genetic as well. So what really that means is that even if a person didn't experience firsthand genocide, colonial policies, traumatic experiences like these, they will suffer from the consequences and the effects of these policies as well. And a word that I use that you might not be familiar with is the concept of survivance, which was coined by Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner. And he defines survivance as an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. Survivance means the right of succession or reversion of an estate, and in that sense, the estate of Native survivancy. The framework that I use is by Danni Reches, and I would like to start with this quote by him when he says that today's Indigenous peoples in North America are the descendants of those who survived the colonizing apocalypse that started in 1492 and continues today. Because colonial policies such as, forced removals or residential schools, or right now in the news some people are discovering the colonial policies, for example, of forced hysterectomies of marginalized women. All of these policies and traumatic experiences are too often relegated to a long gone past. People say, oh, it was in the past, get over it. Well, it's not so long ago, and it still has consequences today. So the contemporary Indigenous speculative fiction that I'm looking at makes fresh use of these historical references to offer us readers innovative ways of understanding this intergenerational trauma. Indigenous dystopian universes have a great deal to teach us about current realities, and we can use fiction, that's what I'm trying to do, to find new ways to confront colonial history and acknowledge its evils. Recognizing the continuous damages of intergenerational trauma is a necessary step to creating avenues for healing and reconciliation with the Re into brackets, because there was no conciliation in the first place. So in my dissertation, I dive into a close reading of contemporary Indigenous dystopian novels in terms of what Justice coins as wonderworks, and you have the definition here. He calls wonderworks these stories which are rooted in indigenous epistemologies to remind us that the way things are is not how they must be. And I argue that such books provide readers with new strategies to overcome and resolve trauma and offer us better alternatives on how to be in the world. A few examples of my corpus. I'm not going to go through all of it, but you might recognize Eden Robinson, her very famous Monkey Beach, the brand new trilogy that's coming out as a TV show next week, the Trickster trilogy. We have Shadows Cast by Stars by Catherine Knudsen, Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones, or his very latest, The Only Good Indians, or The Marrow Thieves by Sherry Malin, which is in its like 40th something printed right now. It's very popular. So despite the very different storylines, cultural and linguistic backgrounds of the authors and the characters, and even the genres of all these books, I found common themes which are present in each and every one of these novels. And I'll give you a few examples today. I found clear references to the physicality of all human and post-human experiences. So for example, trauma and recovery are not only mentioned in the stories, but also repeatedly represented with figures of speech expressing the embodiment of the traumatic experiences. Memories are not only conveyed by, storytelling and diaries and flashbacks in the narrative, but are also embodied by the characters with references to and examples of blood memory. Language and stories are transmitted from one character to another and from one generation to another, with written and oral language. And they're also represented as embodied in the characters' cycles of sickness and recovery and present healing properties for the recovery of one's health. Just like language, the non-human, so the land, stories, are personified and even embodied as well. We have dynamics of kinship and various forms of community, which are represented via new networks created in the stories between different dimensions, different space continuum, time, cycles, and also between different imaginary worlds and different realities. In Algonquian epistemologies, Indudamag are networks of kinship, and that considers way more relations between people than the simple concept of family ever could. We have the weather, we have the landscapes, the flora, the fauna, and all of those are personified and associated with the functioning body, animated with interconnectedness. And all these stories contain tenets of indigenous pedagogies and demonstrate their relevance to indigenous youth. From experiential learning to the importance of language and land, anchored in specific local and cultural traditional epistemologies, the stories contain and showcase how instrumental the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and practices is to survivance. And finally, all the books also share the commonality of focusing on the younger generation and their capacity to navigate both worlds. When I say both worlds, I can mean many different things. We have the Euro-American, Euro-Canadian, Western world and their indigenous community. We have different times and spaces, or actual worlds, because we're in dystopian universes, so different realities, or traveling through time, traveling through space, through gender, or the physicality of changing when we have transformations. The characters symbolize indigenous youth and its plans for a better future, and these novels convey hope in a better future and include cultural markers such as language and stories, like I said, as avenues for healing and the continuity of a healthy and sustaining life. Whether the stories end well or not so much, some of them, the novels focus on hope. So all of this to say that contemporary indigenous speculative fiction uses historical references, whether metaphorically or very explicitly, to offer us innovative ways of understanding intergenerational trauma, and therefore help us find new ways to support Indigenous youth in overcoming it. Now, I'm currently at the end of my PhD. I'm finishing writing my dissertation, and I'm planning on submitting my monograph and defending next year. What am I going to do with that? What's the goal? The goal of this research is to then use the strategies for healing that I found in these books to develop trauma-informed educational guidelines to build bridges of solidarity with Indigenous youth. As educators, we need to identify the specific aspirations of Indigenous youth and change our current curriculum so that we can accompany them all the way. We need to shift our current focus from just school and academic work, and we need trauma-informed, culturally appropriate, holistic services to help us build and foster meaningful relationships. Thank you so much for having me today, and if you have any questions or feedback for me, please don't hesitate and contact me however you choose to. Thank you, Danny.